Welcome to Florida's Cannabis News Podcast, a weekly podcast exploring the legal, political, and economic changes to Florida's cannabis industry, covering important news and events for Florida cannabis businesses and professionals. Sit back and relax. Florida's Cannabis News Podcast begins now.
Hey everybody, today is Friday, November 6th, 2020. Election Day here in the United States just passed, and you're tuned into Florida's Cannabis News Podcast. This is your host, David, and I hope everyone has been coping with the COVID-19 pandemic well, and hopefully everyone made it out to the polls to cast their vote. Today we do have a solid episode. I am updating you on the Florigrown case that is before the Supreme Court of Florida for the second time. In our last episode, we broke down the arguments on both sides of the case, so be sure to listen to that to catch up. I will post the episode link in the show notes. We are also talking about a fan favorite product in the industry today. That's right, edibles have finally hit the Florida medical marijuana market. I myself have tried a few edible products, and they are awesome. This stuff is flying off the shelves, so what I like to do is alert my MMTC ahead of time and find out what day they are getting shipments. Hopefully you have a good relationship with a few bud tenders at your local MMTC to reserve a few of those items. We'll then wrap up today's episode talking about Trulieve's latest acquisition, this time into the state of Pennsylvania. Some other housekeeping items. If you find this podcast useful or you think I do a decent job of relaying the news, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast. Consider subscribing to the podcast and to our newsletter at floridacannabispod.com. I set up the newsletter through our website, so be sure to enter your email there so you can get information, updates, and episodes delivered right to your inbox. We've also expanded our digital footprint into YouTube and now Instagram. Sometimes I like to go on there and do product reviews, show you what events I'm attending, and just increasing the footprint of Florida's cannabis industry. One last thing. I pick the stories I find most relevant for the industry, but please feel free to send me listener questions or news topics you'd like me to discuss. If there's an area of the law or a certain news article that's circulating around in the industry, just please let me know that you'd like me to discuss it, and we'll have it up on the next episode. So with that being said, let's get into today's top story.
This scheme is irrational under any standard. Both the statute does not regulate how much any of these entities have to produce. They can produce one plant, they can produce 1 million plants. So the whole cap and the whole system of doling out these licenses has no rational relationship to the regulatory scheme of making marijuana both safe and available. In fact, it's keeping it from being available.
Today's top story again comes out of Tallahassee, where the Florida Supreme Court heard a second round of oral arguments regarding the Florigrown case. Now, in this episode, we're not going to dive into the nitty-gritty of the case, but to give you a 40,000 degree overview of really what's going on in this case. We're in year 3 of litigation, and essentially what's happening is a MMTC applicant, Florigrown, is challenging Florida's vertically integrated medical marijuana licensing structure. Vertical integration means in order to participate in Florida's medical marijuana market, you must, as a license holder, cultivate, process, and distribute the plant. You have to grow the plant, process it, distribute the plant's products to your dispensaries, essentially seed to sale. In Florida, there are no individual licenses for the different aspects of the industry. That would be a horizontally integrated model, which I think, depending on the outcome of this case, could be Florida's fate eventually. In Florida, there are 22 total licenses available. These 22 licenses operate over 200 dispensaries and serve over 430,000 patients. So Florigrown was an applicant for a license who is challenging the state statute that enacted the vertical integration model that we have today. They're also arguing the way the legislator implemented the law turned it into a special law, which are unconstitutional. Now, on the flip side, The state is arguing the vertical integration licensing structure is constitutional, essentially that it's legal and what the state legislator did was okay, and that the state statute is not a special law, which we will break down later in this segment. So in May of this year, 2020, the Florida Supreme Court heard initial oral arguments, which we have direct audio from the courtroom in our last episode. So if you want to take a listen to hear the lawyers argue both sides in the first round, we do have that audio. So definitely take a listen to that if you are interested. Back in May, I said we probably would not have an opinion by the court for months, which is typical for a state Supreme Court case. But in a unique turn of events, the day after oral arguments in May, the Supreme Court ordered the parties to write supplemental briefs. Specifically, the court issued an order directing the parties to file briefs that address in more detail Florigrown's argument that the state statute is an unconstitutional special law. So, after the parties filed their supplemental briefs, the Florida Supreme Court, in an even more surprising move, scheduled a second round of oral arguments, this one specifically to address the special law issue, which was to be held on October 7th, 2020. Now again, this is all on the court's own motion, sua sponte, they're acting on their own. Now the question is whether Florigrown has a substantial likelihood of success on the merits of their challenge to the statute as a special law granting a privilege to a private corporation. Now, in this case, many private corporations. Now, transitioning from the procedural history into the actual substance of the second round of oral arguments that happened in October, we have this one question presented before the parties. Does Florigrown have a substantial likelihood of success to their challenge of the state statute as a special law? Now, breaking this down into English, what is the meaning of a special law? So generally, a special law is a law that applies to a particular place or maybe to a particular person or a class of people, or in this case, a group of private corporations that is unconstitutional if the government, here the state of Florida, the Department of Health, makes a classification in an arbitrary way or without a reasonable or legitimate justification or basis. Here, granting licenses to a few private corporations without a reasonable basis for granting those licenses. So here, the classification that's before the court is issuing of the licenses. Florigrown is challenging the application and the issuance process the state imposed in issuing the MMTC licenses. So let's start with the state's argument. So here the state is going to argue that Florigrown does not have a substantial likelihood of success on the merits because, well, there's a few reasons. Number one, all MMTC licensees, regardless if your license was granted in 2014, 2016, or 2017, they all must meet the same regulatory requirements. Now, it's important for you to know the history of how the licenses were given out, so please go back and listen to our last episode to get the finer details. But as a general timeline, the state issued licenses in different groups in different years under different schemes. So 22 vertically integrated licenses have been issued and another 11 are available. This is the state's second argument. So Florigrown, they're saying, could just apply for one of those remaining 11. And their last argument, that Florigrown does not have a substantial likelihood of success on the merits, is that if Florigrown did meet the requirements and was prepared to participate in the vertically integrated market, then it could simply just apply for one. So we have Joe Jaco. He was the lawyer representing the Department of Health in the oral arguments, and he broke down his position into essentially two pillars. First, he argued that there shall be no special law granting a privilege to a private corporation, and that the Department of Health did issue reasonable regulations, that is, in implementing their vertically integrated model, to ensure the availability and safe use of medical marijuana, which is the only task imposed on the legislator. So he's saying the legislator enacted their law included the vertically integrated system, and that the vertically integrated system is constitutional. So both of those questions are met. Second, he said the legislator tied the timing of the licensing scheme to ensure medical marijuana was available quickly and safely to Florida's population. All medical marijuana licensees get the same license regardless of when you get it. He had one quote one phrase that I thought was powerful. He said, all the licenses came from one bucket. Each license must meet the same statutory requirements. Joe Jaco also said that Section 8A is a general law, not particularized to a particular entity on its face. He's making a textual argument that the text itself does not specifically grant a privilege to private corporations. But Florigrown will argue that it was the way the legislator implemented the law that granted a special privilege to a few corporations. So here, take a listen to what Mr. Jaco had to say in October.
We've got a really strong argument on this issue about viewing it all as one bucket and not slicing it up into the different things for purposes of class. But I've had a hard time understanding from our case law how when we've talked about classifications on the one hand, and then things that pursue a kind of overarching state interest not being special laws on the other. If this had been a situation where the need for the state, the availability and safety that's referenced in the new constitutional provision, if that could have been satisfied just by expanding the licenses of the existing DOs at the time that the amendment, became part of the Constitution, would it have not been a special law if the legislature had said, okay, the people put this into our Constitution, we need a safe and readily available supply, and so we're going to expand the authority under the licenses that have already been granted, and they just left it at that. Obviously, then that could raise questions as to whether that complied with the new amendment in terms of whether that was, would it allow for sufficient, product and everything. But in terms of a special or general law analysis, would you be able to point to the larger kind of public interest as a way of saying that's not a special law, even though it's identifying, 7 known private entities and giving them this expanded authority?
Sure, and if I understand your question correctly, Justice Muniz, you're saying if the statute only had a subparagraph 1.
Right, which it seems like your argument about the public interest in the larger sort of scheme, it seems like if that's kind of an independent way to deal with the general law problem, then it almost doesn't really matter what the classification is. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
But I don't know if that's the right way to look at the law, and I'm just curious what your view on that is.
Yeah, I have 2 answers to that. First, quick answer in terms of looking at subparagraph 1 and whether it's an open class. I think that it can be argued to be an open class because those licenses don't have to reside with the same MMTC that gets it initially. Those licenses can be sold, they can be transferred. That's done with Department of Health approval. So unlike some of the case law that's found a special law that benefits one city or one tract, here you have licenses that can migrate to different MMTCs. I mean, even
in terms of the privilege granted to a private corporation, the corporation that initially held that license would transfer for a large sum of money. So they would get a privilege under the statute, irrespective of whether it could be transferred, correct?
We don't know that, Justice Lawson. This is a free market operation, and it's one that's done under the regulatory structure of the Department of Health. So the Department of Health has to be involved every time when those licenses are sold, as well as revoking those licenses, having those licenses surrendered. So those licenses...
The record does reflect that they are sold, correct?
Absolutely, they're sold,
Yeah.
which I think proves the point that this isn't a closed class. Even if you look at subparagraph 1, those licenses migrate to other entities, and Florigrown itself can pursue.
The privilege issue is irrelevant until you have established that it's a special law to begin with. And so
That's right.
It seems like the question with this public interest thing, what I'm wondering is that essentially kind of a separate way of looking at it where, if the classification is made in the interest of certain, in this case, you've got this brand new constitutional amendment, the people have prioritized this, they've given the department the criteria and whatever, and if the legislature and the department make the judgment that the best way of satisfying this public need is by essentially just expanding the authority of the 6 or 7, DOs that they inherited. Is that essentially a general law, even if it only applied to that finite group of entities?
The answer is yes, and we've seen that in this court's case law.
Now, part of the state's argument that the state properly implemented this vertical licensing structure and issued licenses at different dates was that it served the public interest to make available safe marijuana. It's an issue of state importance. So the entire regulatory scheme is constitutional because essentially what he's arguing is that the statute balances the interests of the people because by timing the entry of medical marijuana treatment centers into the Florida medical marijuana market and recognizing that this plant is still illegal under federal law, the state balanced the interests, and that was the way they thought was best to achieve the goal of making medical marijuana available and safe to the Florida citizens. Justice Muniz, right in that little back and forth, thought the state's argument about of all the licenses being in one bucket was solid. He thought it was very strong. I thought he asked a great question when he said if the need for safety could have been satisfied by expanding the licenses at the time it became part of the Constitution, wouldn't it not have been a special law had they just expanded their authority? This obviously would raise questions about making sufficient product available to the population. And Joe Jaquat said, yes, because it is an open class under subparagraph 1. The licenses do not have to reside with the applicant itself. So if this was a closed class, then it would be considered a special law, thus granting privilege to private corporations, essentially the first round of applicants, which is unconstitutional. But the lawyers for the state are arguing because the licenses are transferable, which we've seen many examples of the licenses being sold, it's an open class. Anyone could get one as long as you, I guess, have the capital, which in some cases is $40 million. So Chief Justice Kennedy had a great question when he asked, why do companies who are involved in litigation with the state, why do they get a head start over new applicants, over the newcomers? Because remember, some of these licenses were awarded out of litigation. The applicants did not receive a license in the first time they were reviewed. They sued the state of Florida, and they won, thus getting a license. So Chief Justice Kennedy is asking, why are these people who are involved with litigation getting preferential treatment over a new applicant? Listen to Joe Jaquat's response.
Let me ask you why it's not arbitrary to have a provision that provides that someone's eligible for a license because they brought a lawsuit. And they have a lawsuit pending.
Sure. Chief Justice, those entities were all ones that had already been evaluated and scored by the department and deemed at least close to receiving a license. So they are ones that the legislature knew the department was comfortable with, that the department believed would be up and running quickly and safely. And to be honest, even among those in 2A, there are questions of how many of those were available. I mean, there's been arguments in litigation that there were 6, some say 7, some say 10. There's not necessarily a known amount of those. It depended on the readiness of those entities that then filed the litigation. That's the basis of it. Not just the fact that they have a lawsuit, but the fact that they have a lawsuit based on the fact that they've already been scored, they've already been ranked, the department already has a comfort level and experience with them.
So Chief Justice Kennedy responds and says, so the state scored these applications, found the applicants unqualified, they did not meet the standard they needed to meet to receive a license. So now what? Why are these applicants who were deemed unqualified still in contention for licenses? Listen to Mr. Jaquat's response.
Well, no, I think, I don't know how you say they've got a comfort level because they were scored and ranked and found lacking.
That may be true for the first tranche, but as the bucket grows, as more licenses come on board, the department can work with entities, can expand the regulatory scheme. It's starting with those that it has confidence with, has trust in, that have been doing this for several years, and then it expands that scope to newcomers, right?
But how would that? But how would they?
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You're saying how would that apply to the second subsection? Because you're saying I understand how it might apply to the first subsection of approved, but how does that apply to the people that didn't meet the department standard? Why do they get a priority over those newcomers? And how would that not be a closed or a preferential class when they clearly couldn't meet the standards of the department before, and yet the legislature is giving them an advantage over someone that's new to the industry?
Justice Grosshand, two answers to that. One, if there's any claimed advantage that Florigrown makes here, it's purely competition. It's that someone got a head start ahead of them, which has not been deemed to be a basis of a special law. The reason why the statute allocates in those subparagraphs is because we obviously know the DOs are ready to go. I don't think anyone can contest that. We look at subparagraph 2, the statute says these are entities that have been reviewed, evaluated, scored, ranked. They've gone through a Department of Health process. The Department of Health has reviewed them. Now, they may say they're second tier compared to those that were in subparagraph 1, but they still have been scored and ranked, right? They still have met some criteria to become an MMTC. Those guys are more ready, and not only ready, but safe to enter this market than newcomers, than those the department has no idea, including those that won't even agree to a vertical integration model, which is the case with Florigrown.
So Justice Jamie Grosshands, in my opinion, posed an intriguing question when she asked why are the companies who are in litigation with the state, who have a history as applicants and failed to get licenses, why are they being given preferential treatment over newcomer applicants? Especially when the first people, the first group, they didn't meet the qualifications. Essentially, she's saying, shouldn't the state move on and consider new applications? And I think the reason why the justices are bringing this up is because a group of applicants who did not receive licenses did sue the state, did participate in litigation, and were awarded licenses out of that litigation. I think she wants Joe Jayquat to to justify essentially why this happened to these specific applicants. And I thought it was Mr. Jayquat's cheeky response that why would the Department of Health grant a license to an entity that doesn't even agree with the vertical integration model, which is a Florigrown right here, because Florigrown is arguing that the vertical integration model itself is unconstitutional. So why would the state grant a license to a entity who doesn't even agree with how the program is implemented? But again, more on that on our last episode. So now turning the tables to Florigrown, here's what they argued. Well, first they had Catherine Giddings as their attorney. She works for a prominent law firm here in Florida, and this is essentially what they are arguing. Number one, licenses were issued to a privileged group, a long-time tree nurseries. Many of these privileged group sold their licenses. Again, others won their licenses through litigation. Second, the state has not accepted any additional applications, nor is there even an application process in place since 2017. And last, many of the 22 licenses aren't even operating, and the market is only dominated by a few. As we know, if you're a participant, if you're a consumer in the market, or you know a little bit about Florida's medical marijuana market, we know Trulieve, one of the early MMTCs, they control almost near 50% of the market. So, she makes a good point. You've issued these licenses, and only a handful of them control the market. Take a listen.
22 of those entities have received a license. No one else has received a license. They say there are 11 licenses available. They've said there's 7 licenses available. The department has never accepted an application from anyone but these 22 entities. And what they've done is they've given them under 1, they've given them under 2, and then they've gone back down, and as licenses have become available, the department's position is that they have to meet the categories of 1 and 2, and those have to be exhausted first to the exclusion of all others. So this is definitely a closed class, because no one can ever receive the same privileges that these have had. And, they might have an argument as to one that they could be, quote, grandfathered in if they had actually been up and operating. But you've got, of these 22, he says that they're ready. The record shows that they're not. Go to the department's website. They're not ready. They're not, many of them are not dispensing. What kind of privileges are they getting that a normal applicant would not have? Well, they were just entitled to these licenses that were reserved for them. They don't have to go through a separate application process for this new type of program. They're not subject.
They do. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I mean, it does, as your counsel on the other side pointed out, I mean, every single one of these buckets has the qualifier that they have to meet the requirements of this section. So
Your
it's
Honor,
it's all of the new requirements that obviously this gives them a priority in line. But it's not like they're exempted from the requirements that the legislature has decided that these entities, once everybody's up and running, has to be able to do.
no, Your Honor, they received a special privilege because they were all given a license. And of the seven in number 1, almost every one of them have turned around and sold those licenses. So they got these licenses. There were a limited number of licenses, and they sold them. I find it interesting that opposing counsel started out his argument stating that it was a regulatory function because
Justice Coriel has a question for
Oh,
us.
I'm sorry.
No, it's the way this works. What of the point, though, that because there is a liquidity to these things, the fact that they're transferable, doesn't that speak quite directly to the openness or closeness of the class? I mean, if it can be resold, aren't we to understand then that basically anybody can come to acquire it? Doesn't that vitiate the argument that that original group is somehow privileged, if indeed it doesn't even contain the same set of players that it used to because of the liquidity of the license?
So here, Justice Coriel asks an important question that because the licenses themselves can be sold, which again, as I mentioned, we've seen throughout the years, some licenses being sold for 40, 60 million, in addition to real property and other parts of the company, doesn't that make the class open and that the private corporations aren't receiving a privilege because anyone can require a license? Here's what Ms. Giddings had to say in response.
Your Honors, that goes to show just how arbitrary the whole scheme is, because they state that these 22 can get their licenses because they're more ready, but then they're going out and selling them. So that eviscerates their argument that this is somehow some type of permissible regulatory scheme. And remember that if you look at the definition of a special law and a general law, even if you were to find that it wasn't a closed class for these entities that were entitled to their license, you have to have, a general law operates uniformly within permissible classifications. And I would suggest to you that stating that the department was more familiar with their requirements is an after-the-fact justification. At the evidentiary hearing, the department testified that the only reason for giving the licenses to these entities was because the legislature told them it had to do so. There was no, we're more familiar with them. And so whether it's a special law or a general law, these classifications are arbitrary. They were disqualified. They were just suing the legislature.
So throughout the oral arguments and after reviewing the parties' briefs, the state is arguing that because of the rigorous scrutiny required for a facial challenge to a state statute, Florigrown is saying on its face the statute, the text itself, not only the way the statute was implemented, but the text itself being unconstitutional, Florigrown would have to show that there are no circumstances where the law would be valid. And hitting on a point I mentioned before, the state claims there's not a substantial likelihood of success on this case for Florigrown because the MMTC licensing statute itself is a general law. That is, it's uniformly applied throughout the state in the same way to everyone, and that creates a unified system and essentially a rolling expansion of growth for Florida's medical marijuana market across the state. But remember, Florigrown is arguing that a few private corporations, they did receive preferential treatment, essentially getting a head start, which in response, Mr. Jaquad said, nowhere in the case law does getting a head start deem a law a special law. Remember, special laws are unconstitutional because they're granting a privilege to a private either group of people, a class of people, or in this case, a group of companies. Now, in response to Florigrown's argument, the state argued that the court should really be focusing on whether the framework provides for licensure to remain open to new entities, including new applicants like Florigrown. But I think that's a weak argument because the department has never accepted an application from anyone besides the 22 entities. Giddings agreed and said this definitely is a closed class because no one can ever get the same privileges the initial guys got. Of these 22, again, as I mentioned, many of them are not ready. They're not even dispensing or growing plants. Second, Ms. Giddings argued that the vertical integration structure is irrational under any reading of the statute because the system we have doesn't regulate how many plants an MMTC license holder has to produce. So the whole cap on licensing and the limitation of the vertically integrated market has no rational relationship to making marijuana both safe and available, which remember is a task imposed on Florida's Department of Health. That's what the statute says. You must make marijuana safe and available. And as a result, the legislator took that and implemented in what their opinion thought was achieving the goal of this, a vertically integrated structure. In fact, Ms. Giddings said, the vertical integration structure itself is doing the opposite. This limited application is doing the opposite because it's keeping medical cannabis from being widely available to the population. Do you think essentially that the state, in implementing this limited rollout of licenses, is achieving its goal of making medical marijuana safe and available? It's all about balancing the state interests. But later on in the oral arguments, the parties focused on the group of applicants who were deemed unqualified, meaning that they didn't score high enough on the application itself to warrant earning a license. Ms. Giddings said that these applicants, so this was the group of applicants who were deemed unqualified, they sued the state, they went into litigation, and they received a license. So Ms. Giddings is saying, how can this process be rational? Why is the department issuing licenses to applicants who failed the application process itself? One of the justices brought clarity to this issue when they when they stated that they kind of cleared up what the word unqualified means. And I agree with the justice here. What the justice was explaining that unqualified just means, you're missing maybe one or two parts of the scoring process. It's not irrational when you're defining unqualified that way. So on its face, unqualified obviously means, you're not qualified. But maybe some of these litigants, where maybe they were 95% of the way there, they were almost perfect. And at that point, the department has made so much progress with these applicants and scoring them that, let them essentially fix their one or two mishaps and then grant them a license. Some other minor points Giddings, which Florigrown has been raising since the trial level, she was essentially explaining to go and look back at the amendment. The amendment doesn't mention anything about licensing caps, no vertically integrated system, or anything like that. The regulations just demand that medical marijuana be made safe and available and to start registering MMTCs and evaluate the qualifications. So the legislator, in imposing the cap and the vertical structure through the statute, essentially goes beyond the powers the amendment gave them. Now, to me, based on the judge's questions and the general vibes of the oral arguments, it seems like they could be agreeing with the state in that they did meet its constitutional obligations in enacting a limited licensed, vertically integrated structure. At the end of oral arguments, the court did not set a time frame for a ruling one way or another. But if the Supreme Court agrees that the vertically integrated business model is unconstitutional, our medical marijuana market is going to be open to additional standalone licensing opportunities. I mean, it's going to flip the entire market on its head. I don't know. This could have a negative impact on vertically integrated businesses with, because all of these businesses have established, or at least the operating ones, have established a seed to sale supply chain. But if we transfer to a horizontal market where individual licenses are issued based on their step in the supply chain, so for example, if you wanted to get a license just to cultivate or you wanted to get a license just for retail, your company that is focused solely on that part of the supply chain, so for example, let's say you're a cultivator, you could drive down the price of flower by adding to the supply. Now, this will be great for the consumers, but for the current licensees, it could cause some damage to their margins. The Florida Supreme Court is expected to decide this year on whether to break up the vertically integrated structure invented in that 2017 special session. So far, the courts have agreed that the vertically integrated structure, the statute 381.986, runs counter to Amendment 2, which we know legalized medical cannabis in Florida in 2016. But even if the Florida Supreme Court rules the vertically integrated structure is unconstitutional, it will take the state months to draft rules and request new applications. But regardless, I think any ruling one way or another will provide stability to the market, so we can continue promulgating rules and making our medical marijuana market better. I'm definitely going to keep an eye out on this case because of just how monumental it is, and will report back with any developments. Today's second top story also comes out of Tallahassee, where the sale of edible products has finally hit the Florida market. Today we have some great reporting by Jeff Smith from Marijuana Business Daily. I will have his articles posted below in the show notes. But to help along with details regarding Florida's edible market, I did use some articles from perusing the internet, so those sources will be posted in the show notes. But back in April of 2019, Florida's Department of Agriculture finalized its rules for medical marijuana growers surrounding edible products. Now, one of the big concerns about edible products hitting the market was, were they safe in regards to food poisoning and for people with allergies? Why are these two issues a problem? Well, because a lot of times patients who consume medical cannabis already have either compromised immune systems or other health-related issues, so the Department of Agriculture wanted to be more than diligent in ensuring a safe rollout of the edible products. Now, back in April of 2019, the next step was for the Department of Health to issue its rules regarding edible products. Now, these are the rules we've been waiting for. We are now past 1 year since that day, and finally the Department of Health have issued their regulations, which we will definitely break down the important and relevant ones for you. Trulieve, as usual, was first to market here. They sold their edibles in its hometown dispensary of Quincy on September 2nd of this year, 2020. And if you recall, Trulieve was the first dispensary to sell whole flower as well when that became available in 2019. Now, the rules have been a work in progress. Essentially, the medical marijuana market in Florida has been a work in process itself since its inception. Tinctures and oil were initially available. Then we know smokable flower came later, but edibles were essentially put on the back burner because of these developing rules and regulations. But now that's complete and patients can incorporate edibles into their treatment plans. Now back to the regulations specifically. Florida law now mandates edibles take the form of baked goods, chocolates, gelatins, or drink powders. Now, according to Florida regulations, we do have some restrictions on edible products. First, edible products must not resemble commercially available candy. And we've seen this with knockoff brands and parody brands like Sour Patch turning into Stoner Patch or other jokes kind of like that. So the other restriction is that the edibles must be in geometric shapes. So plane, squares, circles, well, you name it, no real animal or other enticing shapes. And third, edibles can include baked goods, chocolate, lozenges, gelatin. So there's a bunch of different form factors the companies can create edibles with. Another important restriction is that the edible products must not resemble any form that appeals to children. Now, this is a provision we see essentially in every state's cannabis market, regardless of recreational or medical. It's a widely used provision. It's widely imposed across the country. So essentially, no bright colors or appealing to children. No resemblance of candies on the commercial market. Remember, we want to ensure the safety and availability of medical marijuana to Florida citizens, not to children. Now, in other markets like Colorado and California, or even in the black market, we can see cannabis products essentially rip off from current candies. So, edibles have actually been a popular product of the black market for being counterfeit and have been the subject of many trademark disputes. So, for example, in March of this year, a California cannabis company called Canico, they were promoting their cannabis-infused cookies that were eerily similar to the Girl Scout cookie brands. Yes, those Girl Scouts. They've had their fair share. The Girl Scouts have had their fair share of legal disputes, ranging from trademark infringement in relation to the famous strain Girl Scout cookies to misappropriation of their trademark, which is the case here. Another example is in August of 2019, there was also a dispute between the makers of Sour Patch Kids versus Stony Patch, which is a maker of cannabis-infused candy in California. So these companies essentially, this company was selling their infused THC candy, parroting the real candy. And when looking at the images online between the two products, I mean, they're virtually identical in the packaging, using the Sour Patch characters we all know and love with the yellow bag, but including marijuana leaves. So it's obvious how a kid could easily, or a child, could easily misconstrue Stony Patch for the original Sour Patch. And another example that's pretty popular in the industry is Hershey's. Hershey's Chocolate. They initiated multiple lawsuits against companies that branded their cannabis-infused products with the names like Mr. Dank Bar, which resembles Mr. Good Bar, and Reefer's Peanut Butter Cups, resembling Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Normally, these cases settle out of court, but, you need to know these do exist. So here's the problem with these candies, and this goes back to why Florida implemented strict regulations with the advertising and the way the edible products look. First problem is confusion. If the products are similar enough that consumers, especially kids, will become confused or easily lured as to which product is the real one and which product contains THC, that's a problem. That's a problem. Remember, our goal is to ensure that medical marijuana is available and safe. And if you're allowing companies to essentially rip off other companies or use their commercial prowess, that's not achieving that goal. The second issue, so essentially we have another issue going on here. We have these established companies saying, hey, when you make cannabis products that resemble our brand, you're tarnishing our name. Because now every time someone buys a Stony Patch or buys a Mr. Dank Bar, they're going to think Sour Patch, or they're going to think Mr. Good Bar. And the makers of these candies, the original makers, probably don't want that association. And that's how, cease and desist letters arise, and that's how lawsuits are filed. Okay, but back to the good stuff. So the release of edible products into Florida's market is important for a variety of reasons. Number one, it's another product the MMTCs can sell. Predictions say the new market segment could generate up to $250 million in sales for the first full year. Now, we know our market in Florida has slowly implemented a full gamut of products. First, in the early days, we had only low THC products that were allowed to be sold. Then it took a little, some more work in the legislature to even sell the whole flower. Now we're seeing the introduction of edible products. We're watching the market advance step by step. Yes, it's at a snail's pace, but we're making progress. And meanwhile, we have the more mature markets on the West Coast that have been selling everything up and down the supply chain for a while. But because their market has a much longer history in relation to the legal cannabis markets generally in the United States, the West Coast suffers from a big black market. And that's why you see a lot of these parody companies getting sued primarily on the West Coast. Now, another reason why the issuance of edibles is important is that the number of Florida patients are rising rapidly. We have over 430,000 patients, and this is just another chance for companies to make more profit. The customer's average age in Florida is around 50 years old, and this part of the market, these citizens have been demanding this form of medication for years, since the beginning. Edible products, they have less stigma associated with them. There's no smoking. They're easier to consume. So I'm glad that they finally got introduced into our market. I'm also interested to see how the introduction of edibles into the market will affect the overall sales on smokable flower and other products. I think the demand for raw flower will always be there no matter what, but it will be interesting to see how much edibles cut into those margins. Now, the third reason why the introduction of edibles is important for us is because the introduction of edibles also brings the opportunity for licensing deals, which fosters new relationships with out-of-state edible companies. And MMTCs have been making moves on this end as a result of new rules being issued. Here are a few examples. So we have Sarasota-based AltMed, which AltMed now has 25 dispensaries across the state, and they operate under the Move brand, MUV. They announced in September an exclusive licensing agreement to produce and distribute Colorado-based Wana Brands edibles. Second example here, we have Trulieve. They've built out a 10,000 square foot commercial grade kitchen. They're going ahead and making their own branded product line of gummies and chocolates. And they already have these products in their storefronts. So make sure to go out whenever you get a chance and ask your bud tenders if they're available. In addition to Trulieve creating their own brand of products, they also have licensing deals set up with companies like Bang in Miami, as well as Denver-based edibles companies Binsky, District Edibles, and Love's Oven to produce cookies, brownies, and other edibles. Now, they are pending state health department approvals, but I'm pretty sure just before I started recording this episode, I saw Trulieve on their Instagram page promoting their Love Ovens cookies. So Trulieve here has 4 or 5 licensing deals in addition to their own branded products. Bluma Wellness, which operates dispensaries under the One Plant Florida brand, they plan to launch edibles later in the year with a focus on gummies, cookies, and a cool product, pretzels. I'm a sucker for pretzels, so I will definitely keep an eye out for those. Bluma Wellness is planning also to sell its own branded products, as well as edibles obtained through a licensing partnership with California-based Venice Cookie Co. We've got some more examples here. So the MMTCs are really hitting hard on the edibles in terms of partnerships. So Fluent, on October 13th, announced that they received approval from the Florida Department of Health to start selling their edible products at each of their dispensaries across the state. Fluent released their own product line called Fluent Gels, which are bite-sized pieces available in a few flavors like green apple, watermelon, and blue raspberry. Fluent makes their edibles in partnership with Smokies, which is a nationally known edible product brand. The gummies are vegan, gluten-free, non-dairy, and contain no high fructose corn syrup. Now, so Fluent, this is cool because Fluent is an example of a company who already is trying to differentiate themselves in this new segment of the industry. It shows how fierce the competition is in Florida. So Fluent is going to try to attract consumers who care about the vegan, gluten-free, non-dairy, who care more of the health, what they're putting in their body. So this is an example of a company trying to set itself apart to gain more of that market dominance, to create their foothold in the market. Now, our final example here is Curaleaf. they also released their line of edible products. They released some fruit gummies, chocolate gummies, apple bars, but I'm actually not sure if they've hit the Florida storefronts yet. My local Curaleaf does not have any of these products in stock, but if you venture to one of these MMTCs, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram. You could find us at FL Cannabis Pod, and just let me know your thoughts on the products. I'd love to hear your opinions. Now, the introduction of edibles raises interesting questions about cannabis and interstate commerce. One question I've been thinking about through this journey of watching the United States cannabis market become legal is their impact on interstate commerce. So we know at the federal level in the United States, cannabis is a Schedule I controlled substance. It's illegal to produce, cultivate, and sell cannabis at the federally speaking. Now, this also means cannabis cannot be transported across state lines. They're federal crimes. These are federal crimes under the Controlled Substances Act. But because of a little thing called the Dormant Commerce Clause, states can implement their own intrastate, that is, in-state cannabis markets that operate only inside a single state. Scholars and legal writers argue that this setup is possible under the Dormant Commerce Clause, where states can have legal markets while producing cannabis is federally legal at the same time. Because under the Dormant Commerce Clause, states may regulate local aspects of interstate commerce so long as they do not unduly burden or discriminate against interstate commerce. But, the Dormant Commerce Clause only applies if the federal government has not acted. So, those scholarly papers that argue that this is possible under the Dormant Commerce Clause, I kind of disagree because the federal government has acted. They've implemented the Controlled Substances Act. So arguing that interstate commerce between states should happen because of the Dormant Commerce Clause, in my opinion, is unlikely to hold weight in court. I think they have a better argument under the 10th Amendment. But states' rights, that whole argument. But in my opinion, we will have to wait until federal legalization to see the actual importation and exportation between state lines of actual products. And rest assured, guys, there are groups every day. There's senators, congressional members, nonprofit organizations, governors working every day to get cannabis federally legalized. There are some interesting developments on the West Coast. There's a group of states doing a pact between each other to ship cannabis between the states. I might tackle this issue in a later episode, but those two states, it's mainly Oregon, but their partner that they're trying to work with is the state of California. So essentially what's going on here is that Oregon, being ahead of the curve as usual, and I don't know if you saw they legalized psilocybin on election night, but last year in 2019, Oregon passed a bill that essentially would allow the importation and exportation of cannabis products, but it doesn't mean anything until another state signs on. No other state has approved rules for exportation or importation. But as I said, California would be the ideal partner here, but there's been no movement on their end in regard to this partnership. Another interesting development we had last year was two Oregon Democrats, Representative Earl Blumenauer and Senator Ron Wyden. They introduced the State Cannabis Commerce Act, which is a federal bill that would allow importation and exportation amongst legal states that have legal markets. But the bill actually had, it had some hype across the cannabis mainstream media, but it has stalled in the House, in a House subcommittee, and I definitely will report back on developments relating to these two issues. But again, back to the states and their own cannabis markets. States are allowed essentially to create their own cannabis markets because first of the 10th Amendment, states' rights, the Cole Memo, which essentially says is an informal agreement that the federal government will not use federal funds to prosecute cannabis operators who are abiding by state law. Now, the trick here is that these states or the companies that operate in the states, they cannot participate in interstate commerce between the states. They cannot create cannabis products in one state and ship it or, do transaction between state lines. So the question becomes, how are these companies, how are these Florida MMTCs, How is Curaleaf, Trulieve, Fluent, how are they doing partnerships with other companies across state lines if it's federally illegal if it's federally illegal? Well, the main problem federal prohibition places is essentially this. So, for example, a Colorado cannabis edible manufacturer cannot create edible products in Colorado and then ship their products to California. Rather, what this hypothetical Colorado cannabis company has to do is that they have to set up a partnership with a manufacturer in California to produce their edibles in California. Now, putting your business owner hat on, this makes operations for you so much more expensive. I mean, now they're going to have to find a partnership with a manufacturer in California. They're going to have to teach them how to make their gummies and ensure it's the same exact high quality gummy they produce in Colorado. I mean, wouldn't you rather just continue with your manufacturing operations in Colorado and then just simply put your edible products in a cardboard box and ship them to California? Now, because of because of the federal prohibition on interstate commerce, it requires you as your Colorado operator to go and set up a new shop in California. Now, this example brings light to how far behind the barriers essentially it just shows how far behind the cannabis industry is to every other industry in the United States. The barriers the companies in this industry face is crazy. It shows how young the market really is. I mean, can you think of another industry where a business cannot ship their product across state lines and make sales, especially in the digital age of e-commerce? So, for example, applying this law to our partnerships in Florida. So let's take the partnership with AltMed and Wana Brands. AltMed Florida, they have an agreement to produce Wana brand edibles in Florida and distribute in Florida. So Wana Brands, what they do, they're not located in Florida, but they probably set up their standard operating procedures with AltMed. AltMed follow those procedures in their kitchens in Florida. Now, in a perfect world where cannabis is legal on the federal level, all Wana Brands would have to do, because they're based out of Colorado, would simply ship their edible products to AltMed in Florida. Thus, they would be able to bypass all of the extra legwork that needs to be done to set up operations in Florida. But no, that's not how it works. So essentially what they're doing is they're setting up a partnership and they're going to make AltMed produce the edible products. Partnerships between the MMTCs and edible companies, it's a workaround businesses are using to expand their operations in this super regulated market and provide a more diverse array of products into their states. Edibles is a perfect example of a product that shows the workarounds companies can do to get around the federal prohibition. Now, let's take a moment to imagine a world where it is federally legal. It would twist our current setup, our current valuations of these companies. It would twist it up tenfold. If all of a sudden we went federally legal, let's say under the Biden administration, we go federally legal, states who do not allow cannabis in their state, they cannot prohibit companies from selling cannabis in their states. So states wouldn't be able to block or limit out-of-state companies from entering their state and selling cannabis. Of course, there would be regulations like state licensing issues, but we also have to consider what would happen to these intrastate licenses. Remember, if you get a license in one state, it's only allows you to do operations in that state. So in our current situation, we know states have their own licensing structures. States issue their own licenses. If you have a Florida license, you could only operate in Florida. So what happens to the value of these licenses that have sold for $40, $60 million? I think the value would be shown in being a first mover. I think being a first mover, the value of that will truly be shown if we go federally legal. The market will tell us. It will always tell us in the end. We'll truly see how important being a first mover in the industry is once we're legalized on the federal level. I think federal legalization would be more efficient, but it would cause massive disruption to our industry as we see it today. We could see big companies come in and acquire the multi-state operators like we've seen with Constellation Brands and Canopy Growth a few years ago. Not that Canopy Growth is a US MSO, just that we see big companies, billion-dollar companies like Constellation, make investments into the biggest cannabis company in the world at one point, Canopy Growth. And we could see opportunities for smaller businesses to really get their foothold in the industry. We'll see what happens under the next administration, but it's definitely an interesting development. Our last top story this week again comes out of Tallahassee, Florida, where Trulieve has announced they are expanding operations into Pennsylvania. The sources for this story are provided by Trulieve on newswire.com. I will have the sources, as always, in the show notes. So as we mentioned in the last segment, because of the prohibition on interstate commerce of cannabis, a way companies are expanding their footprint beyond the licensing deals is to simply acquire other licenses or other operating businesses in other states they find value in, and essentially going in, acquiring the license, turning the license into their company, and setting up operations in that state. Now, it's not that Trulieve is essentially, making or growing cannabis in Florida. They have a license in another state and they're shipping their cannabis from Florida to that other state. No. They are just acquiring a license in Pennsylvania and starting operations in that state by itself without an association to their operations in Florida. So as we know, Trulieve is the dominant player in Florida today. They have over 64 dispensaries the last time I checked. Tremendous leadership with CEO Kim Rivers. They own the majority of Florida's market share. And expanding operations into Pennsylvania will be Trulieve's move into a total of 5 states. They are definitely gaining ground. So details about the acquisition: Trulieve went ahead and acquired 2 cannabis firms for a total of $66 million. The first acquisition was a company called Pure Pen. Now, Pure Pen is a grower and a processor, and Trulieve acquired that company for $46 million in cash and stock. Pure Pen is one of only 15 active growers in the state of Pennsylvania. Pure Pen ships products to dispensaries throughout the state. They also have a 35,000 square foot grow facility, and they plan to expand that to 90,000 square feet by the end of Q1 in 2021. Now, the second part of the acquisition was a dispensary operator called Keystone Relief Centers, which does business as Solevo Wellness, for $20 million in cash and stock. Solevo owns 3 dispensaries around the Pittsburgh area. Now, Pennsylvania is a very interesting state. There's a ton of room for growth, especially on the retail side here, because the state has allowed, through their state law, has allowed for roughly 200 dispensary locations, and only roughly 90 of those locations are up and running. So we see here a lot of room for growth. There's still a lot of land to grab in Pennsylvania. And as we've seen in Florida, it seems like Trulieve is opening a new dispensary every other week. I mean, every time I go on the internet, Trulieve has a new shop set up. So I can imagine they're going to continue their retail domination in Pennsylvania. Now, as I mentioned, Trulieve acquired 2 companies in Pennsylvania. Clearly, it shows that Pennsylvania is not a vertically integrated model, because we have Pure Pen, who is a grower and processor, and we have Solevo, who is a dispensary operator. So there's multiple licenses you can acquire in the state of Pennsylvania, which again, I think Florida will end up going to that hybrid, horizontally integrated model. But diving in, comparing Pennsylvania to Florida, right now Pennsylvania is a medical market, but there's a big push for adult use. In September, Pennsylvania's governor and lieutenant governor made a big social media campaign for adult use cannabis in 2021. In September, the governor told news outlets the state needed the revenues cannabis is producing in other states. It seems like the Pennsylvania governor is looking at other states and realizing, cannabis is a seriously money-making industry. A full adult use regulated market would do wonders for revenue growth in the state, as it has done in essentially every state that has implemented a market. And I think especially with COVID, it could help small businesses recover from the stagnation and the pause COVID has imposed on these struggling small businesses. After reading some reports online, it seems there's a big push from Pennsylvania's executive branch for adult use. But the Pennsylvania legislature will likely stall on adult use marijuana this fall. So definitely expect something or, some development to happen in 2021. Nonetheless, it does appear Trulieve believes the state will go recreational, and maybe that's part of the reason they're a pioneer in this state. Other information about the Pennsylvania market: currently Green Thumb Industries, which, if you're familiar with the cannabis stocks or the finances of the cannabis industry, they're another large multi-state operator. They're based out of Chicago. They're right now the dominant player in Pennsylvania, having 10 retail stores. And look at that. The dominant player in Pennsylvania has 10 retail locations, whereas the dominant player in Florida has over 65. Pennsylvania has a big patient count, though, 330,000 patients, and they're the 5th most populated state in the country. This is definitely an exciting state to watch. Now, check this out. So Pennsylvania capped dispensary licenses, which means retail licenses, at 50. And they have separate licenses for growers and processors at 25. So Pennsylvania has a horizontally integrated market, which is why Trulieve acquired 2 licenses. They acquired 2 entities to essentially create that full seed to sale. So now, with both licenses under Trulieve's name, Trulieve can implement their vertically integrated model they've been running in Florida for years, but now they can implement it in Pennsylvania. Why would they do this? Well, they've mastered the seed to sale operation in Florida, and hopefully their standard operating procedures are uniform enough and can be easily scaled into a new market. It's truly fascinating stuff, the way these business models are working. Now, in Pennsylvania, we see the horizontal market at play because PurePenn is a wholesale cultivation entity, and Solevo is more of the retail distribution side. In Pennsylvania, there are 33 companies that are licensed to cultivate, and 26 growers were deemed operational. Only 15 of the 26 were actively shipping to dispensaries. So 50% of the allowed cultivators in Pennsylvania are actually in business. Now, these are numbers reported again by Jeff Smith of Marijuana Business Daily, MJ Biz Daily. So shout out to Mr. Smith for these awesome numbers. Now, we see a similar setup here in Florida, because this is what Ms. Giddings was talking about in her oral argument. She was explaining that even though operators in Florida have the same license, you see some companies with, dozens of dispensaries, but you also see license holders in Florida that only deliver, or you see license holders that simply have only put 1 plant in the ground. So it's what's going on in what's going on in Florida is similar with Pennsylvania. Of these companies allowed to cultivate, some of them aren't even doing business. They could just be holding the license. But based on the press release, it appears PurePenn will continue to operate its wholesale model while also being part of Trulieve's vertically integrated model. Now, even though Trulieve is moving into a state that doesn't demand vertical integration, it seems like Trulieve is going to continue their seed-to-sale setup because it's easier to scale the business that way. If Trulieve have been operating their verticals for 4 years, it should be, easy. It's easier said than done, but in theory, it should be easy for Trulieve to expand into Pennsylvania and rinsing and repeating in each state that they find value in. Trulieve doesn't want to go into another state and just be a cultivator or just operate one dispensary. They want to implement their model in a way that they've tinkered with into another state and run that model to realize a profit. So it's a pretty cool acquisition, a pretty big acquisition. And thank you to Jeff Smith and Trulieve and Newswire for providing numbers and sources on this story. Hey listeners, so as a reminder, we have all of our news we cover here on the podcast in the show notes and linked to our Twitter account at FL Cannabis Pod. I'd love to continue the discussion on other forms of social media, whether it's Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. That's a place where I like to provide micro content throughout the week, talk about current events, and answer listener questions if you have any. Feel free to follow us on Instagram, again, at FL Cannabis Pod. This is more, I'm turning that into more of a lifestyle page where I'll do product reviews, post about upcoming events, and look at really cool pictures of the cannabis industry. And let me know, what areas of the podcast you don't necessarily like. I want to make the podcast a better experience for you. So, shoot me an email, david@flcannabispod.com. Check out our website, flcannabispod.com. Subscribe to our newsletter. And yeah, I just want to get you guys the best and most accurate information in a timely way. Okay, so this week's weekly patient count from Florida's Office of Medical Marijuana Use, we are looking at their October 30th update. I left their weekly update page in the show notes, so you can go ahead and click to see their latest numbers. We are at 438,559 registered patients in the state. We are at 289 dispensaries. And due to COVID-19, I'm not seeing many cannabis events happening across our state, but when I do, usually they will be online, and I will have those on Twitter, and I will publish those on Instagram. And thank you so much. That's it for Florida's top cannabis news. If you have any stories or events you want to share, again, connect with me on Twitter, reach out on Instagram, email me, add and rate us 5 stars, and share with your friends who could be into the podcast. Thank you for staying up to date with Florida's cannabis industry. See you next time.